So good morning, everybody. If we could ask everybody to sit down. Okay, great, thanks. So good morning and welcome to day 2 of Discovery. We're delighted to welcome you to this panel session, Cybersecurity Issues and Opportunities. I'm John Fielding. I'm the Regional Director of Eastern and Northern Ontario for Business Development for Ontario Centres of Excellence. So those of you who had the privilege of seeing our keynote speakers yesterday, Salim and Brad, you got the impression of how ubiquitous cyber is, right? And they even talked about their kids not learning how to drive a car because it'll all be done for them, right? You also heard when a question was asked that actually cybersecurity is one of their biggest concerns. So that's what this panel is about. It's about protecting our data, our infrastructure, and that our economy actually depends on. The market for cybersecurity solutions is projected to be almost double to $120 billion by 2017. This panel will address the expertise, preparation, and opportunities for cooperation across security types, services, and technologies, and challenge industry to think outside the box in the development of new approaches dealing with cybersecurity. I'm now delighted to introduce our moderator for this panel session, Jeffrey Tracey. He's a business development for Venus Cybersecurity Corporation, and they have a booth here today. I encourage you to go see it. And as well, OCE is a founding member of Venus. Following a career in remote sensing application development, Jeff became a senior advisor to Foreign Affairs Canada, conducting research and development of technologies for arms control verification. Subsequently, Jeff trained as a biological weapons inspector by the United Nations Monitoring, Verification, and Information Commission, and spent 6 years with a major defense contract in Washington, D.C. Most recently, Jeff introduced several cybersecurity solutions into key government departments during his tenure with an Ottawa-based IT security company. And he continues to promote cybersecurity program through his work with the Venus Cybersecurity. Please welcome Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, John. Thanks, John. And also, thank you to the OCE for being a valued member in Venus. We really appreciate your support. I want to go back 11 years, and I was in Iraq. I'm looking for weapons of mass destruction, and I'm working with a cadre of experts from the CBRNE crowd. Do you know what that means, CBRNE? Anybody? Chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, explosives. Okay, and so those are, 11 years ago, those were considered some of the main weapons of mass destruction. But 11 years later, we're faced with another weapon of mass destruction, and that is the cyber world. Okay, and that is a global issue that we all have to face. I work for Venus Cybersecurity Corporation. We have been established to make Canada a leader in cybersecurity. And that's our aim and that's our goal. We do that through having an ecosystem. We have a Venus Institute, which is the academic arm and the network across Canada. We have a Venus infrastructure. We have a building that houses 40 people. We have quantum, where we have cyber computing power with Cray support. We have Venus Ventures, where we can provide acceleration and incubation support to small companies as well as some venture capital. And so we look at cyber as an interdisciplinary approach. We're looking at it differently. We have to work together. We have to work on the academic arm, combined with the private sector, combined with the government, and all work together in order to solve Canada's cybersecurity problems. So that's what Venus is doing. So enough of that pitch. I'd like to introduce our panel members. Thank you, folks, gentlemen, so much for coming in, taking time out of your busy schedules. It is you are busy, I know that. So I'm going to introduce you, but do that backwards. If I'm going to first introduce Mike Mosca from the Institute for Quantum Computing at the University of Waterloo. Mike is the Deputy Director for IQC and is doing some fantastic work and very interesting work related to quantum cryptography and quantum key distribution. So he's going to talk more about the research they're doing at the University of Waterloo. Paul Milkman, thank you, sir, for coming in. Paul is with the TD Bank Group. He is the vice president for all of North American security for TD. So it's a huge issue. And can you imagine the amount of data that they have to deal with protecting in terms of credit card information, transactions? It's unbelievable. We'll learn more about that today. And good luck with that, Mike. Sunil Chand is with Telus Corporation. Telus is also a founding member of Venus Cybersecurity Corporation. And I'd like to talk to you about Cisco. Cisco now estimate there are at least 10 billion internet-connected devices out there, and by 2020 they estimate that's going to be 50 million. Of course, they are the originators of the Internet of Things, and that scares the telecommunication companies like Telus. When you have all of these devices with third-party software, unprotected, how do you protect yourself to ensure that your networks still is protected? I'd like to introduce Doug Thomas. Doug is with the Independent Electricity Systems Operator Group. Who remembers the blackout of August 2003? Right? Pardon me? I think it was 2003. You maybe Doug will be able to. It was 3. Okay. So we're that was the worst blackout in history. 2 days, people went out without power in New York City, and people died with no air conditioning. So that is something we want to avoid, and Doug is there trying to help us avoid that nasty issue. So, we have Eugene Roman from Canadian Tire. Thank you, Eugene, for coming in. Love your store. Who's been in Canadian Tire in the last 6 months? Right. So, can you imagine walking in and you're going to buy your patio set, and the shelves are empty, right? Because the supply chain that is providing those services, those goods to Canadian Tire was disrupted somehow. Or can you imagine the accounts and the account information and personal information they have related to your credit card account at Canadian Tire? So that is to be protected, and Eugene's going to tell us more about that today. And last but not least, we have Ray Boisvert. I've known Ray for a couple of years now. We've worked together in my previous world. Ray has a career with ISECIS as the director for intelligence. Now, can you imagine? Aren't you? I'm curious. What's in there that he has? You know, he's got so much information, right? But now what he's doing with his company ISECIS is providing that knowledge out to the public sector and providing them with vulnerability assessments, vulnerability threats assessments. So we'll hear more about that right now, I think, won't we? Thank you. Over to you.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Number of things. I worked 33 years in the security intelligence business. I started off with the RCMP in the early days before there was a CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. That was mostly because to go into the security service, which was part of the RCMP in those days, you had to go through the front doors of that building or that organization. I benefited from that for a lot of reasons. What Jeff mentioned in terms of now what I do outside dealing with private sector entities and still consulting with government is try to bring some of that knowledge piece forward. And more jokingly, when he said all that stuff's up there, actually not a lot is there. But I did learn to get smart enough over the years to respect more of the things I didn't know than the things I actually did know. And that was part of the driving force behind the intelligence director at CSIS when I left, is to actually go out there and close those gaps, understand the nature of the contemporary threat landscape. Which brings us to today. What we're dealing with today, and I come by this extremely honestly when I make the comment, because I have been accused every once in a while of being part of the fear industry, is that essentially there is in fact much to fear. And I became very frustrated in the last couple of years before I left the service in 2012 was to say that We ourselves, as organizations involved in national security, security intelligence, had so much focused on the issue of counterterrorism, and for just cause and for good reason. And in fact, before I became the assistant director responsible for intelligence, I was the director general of the counterterrorism program. At the height of the kidnappings of Amanda Lindhout in Yemen or Somalia, and Melissa Fung and Robert Fowler, Louis Gay in Niger, in Mali, these were significant pieces. The Afghan campaign, Canadian forces were deployed, ISECIS was there in close support. So I come by the counterterrorism narrative naturally. I lived it, I believe it, and I still believe it's the most significant threat to our civilization in terms of radicalization, the Al-Qaeda narrative, and other things. Having said that, I also have become extremely conscious of the fact that we purposely chose to ignore the issue of the theft of intellectual property. In other words, espionage. Not Cold War style espionage, but new age espionage, using new technologies, new approaches, but also mostly targeting a very different set of entities, mostly those in the private sector. I choose this theme, chaos, because it's always one of those things, I think it's, again, reflects my opening comment about the fact there's lots of unknowns out there, a lot of things that could evolve very rapidly. In that 30 plus years, I've never seen a more dynamic, fast-moving, high-velocity threat landscape than we're seeing currently. Why? Because one of the most important things that I've been describing of late is this issue I call democratization of power. It's the ability, it's that asymmetrical warfare piece, it's that ability of small numbers of threat actors, malicious individuals, who can have disproportionate effect when they choose to act out, when they go out and target something for a number of reasons, and I'll come back to some of the motivations and some of the potential target sets that are affected by these new capabilities in the hands of highly skilled and now highly motivated in some cases, but certainly individuals who can target at will, and I'll hopefully demonstrate how easy that is in just a few thoughts down the road. My objective over the next probably 5 or so remaining minutes is just give you a sense of some of the things that really do matter, I think, in the cyber environment in terms of what kind of actors, what kind of threat environment we're really talking about. And of course, others who are specialists in their fields will be able to certainly fill you in on some of the things that reflect core to their business. Let me give you a sense of this thing, the APT, or the Advanced Persistent Threat. Though I'm not a technology person, I'm not an engineer, I'm a career intelligence officer, but I get the technology, but I'm really more about threat actors. I'm more about the motivations, the motives, because in my view, cyber defense, cyber resilience is really more about people than it is about technology, but only slightly more. But nevertheless, one part that I think is quite often overlooked and undervalued. The issue here, though, of course, is that APTs, this ability to be able to create this incredibly complex, stealthy exploit, used to be strictly the domain of nation states. In other words, countries such as the United States, China, Russia, others, Canada included, which significant technological capabilities was able to create opportunities and technologies to exploit information around the world, as well as use many techniques to defend those particular interests. The difference now, however, is that we've seen things shift tremendously. First and foremost, to my mind, still in that category of nation states, is that there are a whole bunch of sub-actors that are either acting as proxies for countries. We've seen the Mandiant report, we've seen the accusations of China and other countries using either universities, institutes, private companies, hackers, a whole bunch of individuals who are for hire to pursue their interests. But there are a number of other states that do it directly, but they're unexpectedly high capability. And from them, some of the organizations that they sponsor have become exceptionally strong. Case in point, Hezbollah. Hezbollah has been known as a provider of needs for those who are disenfranchised or dispossessed in that part of the world, but they're also listed as a terrorist entity in most jurisdictions around the world. They have significant cyber capability. Why? Because Iran now has significant cyber capability. And Iran, like North Korea and a bunch of other countries who are juxtaposed against Western interests, who are working somewhat collaboratively in a number of fronts, from missile technology to now cyber, are sharing approaches and purchasing things off the internet. As you know, exploits are widely available on the black market. They go as cheaply as $200 to $500 to as high as $200,000 to $300,000, depending on the sophistication of it. Most attacks involve very simple exploits. Iran was reported today in one of the news items I received saying that they have now created their first very advanced exploit, custom made by Iran, to be used elsewhere. It's probably a variant of Stuxnet, which has been captured and now replicated and turned into other devices. So other nation states are out there. They're below the typical groups. Let's not overlook organized crime. In permissive environments such as Russia, China, and elsewhere, these organizations thrive. They thrive because there are high levels of education, and the connection between the state and criminal organizations is very, very thin. In fact, it's veneer thin. So agents of the state, be the SVR, the FSB, the old KGB in Russia, I would suggest work very closely with a number of organized crime teams because it's of the benefit to many. It's benefit to the pocketbook of the locals, but it's also seen as a disruptive weapon against the West. And we'll see more of that as time moves on because they have become greatly empowered and they're changing the nature of transnational criminal organizations. And they, I believe, are having even a greater effect. In fact, they're first and foremost in my mind in terms of thinking about intellectual property, thinking about wealth, and the challenges that we all face as organizations or individuals who are part of our societies, who benefit from that system. The other sort of topical organization is really more an amorphous amalgamation of individuals who quite often self-righteously determine that whatever you're doing is inimical to our society, our liberal values, or whatever the case may be. It could be your company, it could be your organization, it could be you as an individual. It goes right down to the issue of identity theft, all the way up to disruption and denial of service, if they believe that you represent everything that's wrong in our society. And they do so very willingly, and they do so with, again, great significant capability that has grown exponentially over the last number of years. A little example of disproportionality and asymmetrical threat warfare. Look at the Syrian Electronic Army. There's a good example of probably no more than a few dozen people, probably, and I sort of visualize this idea, they're somewhere in Aleppo or Damascus in a half-bombed out shelter with intermittent internet connectivity and electricity, working off a few laptops. They get behind the paywall of New York Times, they disrupt Harvard University, and the list goes on. There's probably 3 or 4 dozen different important, iconic organizations that are suffered at the hands of individuals who are supporting the Assad regime. But again, significantly empowered, disproportionately so, and able to reach around the world. So things are no longer local. Then, of course, is the individual. It is that person still living in their parents' basement, again, highly skilled, highly motivated. Maybe it's the insider. Maybe it's the former employee. I've worked on a number of cases for some companies, some high-tech companies that were losing their intellectual property. In each one of those cases, it was a former employee who was now acting out against them from the confines of his residence or their residences and doing the things they needed to do. So again, individuals, if highly motivated, can either acquire the exploits necessary through the internet or find others who work on their behalf. I'll quickly shift gears. I want to talk a little bit about that asymmetrical piece in the sense of why things have moved so quickly and why, at the end of the day, what's really important is the motivation, the human motivation. Betrayal will continue as a foundation piece. Years ago, espionage in the Cold War was really about stealing government secrets, military secrets, state secrets. It involved some technology, absolutely, but the most effective weapons were moles, insiders, individuals who are either recruited within an agency or, in our business as ISECIS, we were humenters. In other words, we valued human intelligence and we pursued human intelligence to recruitment and betrayal of other persons in an organization. That continues unabated in many ways. Lieutenant Jeffrey DeLille, the naval lieutenant who was arrested almost 2 years ago now, demonstrated that. The 12 Russian illegals arrested in the United States back in 2010, another good example that it really does still work. But think about it now in the corporate context and thinking about how the issue of loyalty has changed tremendously in the corporate world, and where people now feel like they're all freelancers and feel that if at one point they are aggrieved that they have been mistreated, that they've been disrespected, they can, I think, engage in this issue of asymmetrical warfare and betrayal of trust and betrayal of others. I'm with a new client this week. I was with them yesterday. They had a very significant case of insider damage, and the pathology was the same as I saw in the old FBI cases in the 80s and 90s. The impact of betrayal on the organizational culture, on colleagues and others, not to mention the reputation of an organization, the brand, the impact on share values, what regulators will do subsequent to a serious cyber attack or others. Think about insurance. Lloyd's of London's made it very clear, insurability will be increasingly based on the corporate risk register that must include cyber as a significant value. So I'll just quickly move ahead. I think I've probably taken more time than I expected. Technology will matter. Signals intelligence, Ed Snowden's made that point extremely well. Technology will facilitate espionage by nation states and by others. But ultimately, though, the target is, in this day and age, the corporate world. It is corporate Canada, and it is those affiliated, and it's increasingly through third parties. Supply chain is critical. The Target store event demonstrated that in spades, and the vulnerabilities of those. Large corporations are doing a very good job at defending. Those who supply their services and products, a lot less so. So I'll stop there just because I think I'm well over my time. But anyhow, thank you. And then at the end of that, I'll finish off with one more point. I can go on and on about all of the things that can bite and all the things that can destroy an organization's reputation or take away somebody's personal or institutional wealth. But resilience is easily achieved, and it starts by openness, being frank, discussing these things, admitting vulnerabilities, and going out there and developing the best methodologies combined with the best possible technologies in the marketplace. It's not an end game that's going to result in catastrophe. There's still very, very good work and significant opportunities out there, and especially for the private sector. I was in Los Angeles 2 weeks ago at a meeting hosted by the mayor of Los Angeles and the chief of LAPD. The top law enforcement officers in North America and Europe were there. The head of Interpol said, when it comes to cybercrime and it comes to the state's ability to counter that, we're not doing so well. So that means I tell my clients, we're in this by ourselves. We're going to have to fend for ourselves and fix things ourselves because we can't rely on law enforcement's abilities at the current moment and state of play. The good news is for private sector entrepreneurs, there's tremendous opportunity out there. So good luck.
Thank you very much, Ray. Doug Thomas. That's great.
So thanks for this. So my name is Doug Thomas, and I'm the Vice President, Information Technology Services and CIO for the Independent Electricity System Operator. And just a brief history. So the ISO was born out of the demerger of Ontario Hydro back in 1999. It split off into Ontario Power Generation, Hydro One, Electrical Safety Authority, and ourselves. Just have a couple of different slides that I'll talk to. The first slide you can see is effectively a picture of our control room, and you can see that that is the wall board that the electrical engineers look at in terms of monitoring the grid. I think we all understand how integral electricity is to everything we do on a daily basis, particularly as we get more and more electronic devices. I think we've seen that in whether it is the 2003 blackout, which was referred to earlier on. I should say, interestingly enough, that was not a cybersecurity issue. That was as simple as people not trimming trees underneath high power lines, although it had lots of things that happened after that. That actual blackout had a much more basic start to it. But we've seen it again in terms of the floods in Toronto in summer 2013 and the ice storm. So I think if you look at what our role is, I think you can look at our role as effectively an air traffic controller for Ontario's electricity system as it looks. And if you think about what an air traffic controller does, at all times they know which planes there are, where those planes are, what type of planes they are, where they're going, where they came from. And they need to make sure that there is landing space available for the planes and that all the planes are appropriately spaced apart. And that's really what we end up doing for the electricity system. And we manage the 500 kV, the 230 kV, and the 115 kV lines. And if you think of those large hydro towers that you see in football fields and hydro right-of-ways along the highway, that's effectively us. And to give you a sense of the scale of it, there's about 30,000 kilometers of high voltage wires across the province of Ontario. And what you see here is a picture of that wallboard. So what we do on a second-by-second basis is we manage the electricity, the flow of electricity across the province, making sure that there is always enough generation to meet demand in the province and that it is at the right spot, so that we always make sure that the high voltage lines are operated within their limits. The other thing we do, though, is we actually run a market. And there is a market in terms of the energy industry for generators and large consumers. And we set a different price for energy every 5 minutes. And we dispatch generation up and down every 5 minutes. So it really is, both for the grid and for the market, there really is a tremendous amount of activity on an ongoing basis. And to give you a sense of it, we collect 20,000 data points every 3 seconds from meters across the province. That is the wealth of information that comes into our systems every day. We put out 75,000 reports a day. As I said, we send out dispatch instructions across the province every 5 minutes. So how has it changed? Well, I think, and it's been referred to a couple of times, we really are a much more interconnected group of people than we were 10 or 15 years ago. And if you look, you can see, on the left, you've got the ISO, and obviously we're connecting with generators of various types, other energy utilities, transmitters, and distributors. But really, and we will have seen through literature recently talk about the smart grid. And really what that's starting to get is it's a tremendous ability to empower customers to make their own choices. So you now have time of use meters in all the homes in Ontario. You now have embedded generation in certain instances on people's roofs. You are now getting appliances that can determine whether or not they want to run based on time of day or electricity price, system conditions. You have people accessing their energy home systems with smartphones and tablets. And so all of that is really, really great in terms of empowerment of the customer. However, what it does is it expands the complexity and, if you will, the risk to our organization that we need to manage, because the number of people and the way they interact with systems is much more pervasive. They may interact with the distribution system, but that distribution system will impact our system as they go in and get reports, et cetera. The other piece, of course, is we're connected very much within Ontario, but we are connected within the Northeast as well. So we have direct connections, as you can see, with Hydro-Quebec, New York ISO, Michigan, and MISO. And we are very interdependent on the ability of the grid and our neighbors to manage it, and they are equally dependent upon us. And as you said, if you look back to that 2003 that took out most of Ontario, it didn't originate in Ontario, but ended up affecting a huge swath of the northeastern United States. So we work very closely, not just with industries in Ontario, but we work very, very closely with organizations in the Northeast. There is an organization called the North American Electrical Reliability Corporation, and then there is the Northeast Power Coordination Council. And effectively what we've put in is there are industry standards with respect to the steps that our organization and other organizations like ours need to take to ensure the reliability of the grid. They are physical, and as well, in 2006, we actually added specific standards with respect to the protection of cybersecurity assets in our organizations such as ours. So there are 9 standards with about 45 different requirements that we as an industry have set to try and make sure that we adequately protect the security systems and the grid reliability. Because it really is, as you will hear from everybody, it is an extremely complex system, and we are very dependent upon it to run the market. We obviously do a lot of information sharing both with government agencies, other industries, and particularly, or not particularly, but as well with organizations in the States such as other ISOs. And I think it really is a matter of, and we'll talk about it later on, it really is a matter of both prevention, but it is also a matter of outreach to try and understand, to try and share information, and we are doing a lot of that because, as Ray said, one of the things that is a real challenge for organizations is the speed with which cybersecurity moves and the ability of an organization to adapt its systems to those vulnerabilities. And so it's as important to actually understand what is coming in terms of the world of cybersecurity as it is to react to when it actually arrives. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Doug. Paul Milkman, up to you.
Okay. Well, thank you for having me here. I'm going to draw on Ray's slides and a little bit on what Ray talked about, which was if you think back to the Russian mob and all the sort of criminal organizations and the individuals who might be disenfranchised, and you think about the world that we live in, I'll add one aspect, which is cultural, and that is to say, if you look at economic charts today, if you look at the gap between the wealthiest individuals in a country and the average citizen, the US and Canada have the biggest disparity now of the developed world. The danger of that is that we're in danger of disenfranchising more and more people as time goes on. And so if you're a bank, that's actually a big consideration. It used to be that banks didn't worry about things like cybersecurity because there was no cyber. We had a vault, there was money in it, and we had customers. Sometimes we had business customers. Sometimes we lent money, sometimes we got it back, sometimes we didn't. Relatively simple business. Our world has changed dramatically. There's, I guess, 35 million Canadians, 24 million of them, I think, are customers of banks, of the 6 large banks, and 20 million of them are online. So we're not dealing with a vault and a customer anymore. We're dealing with something that looks more like this. And so now I want you to think back to Ray's slides and say, we've got the Russian mob, in some cases the Chinese government, the North Koreans, Iranian state-funded terrorism in some cases, many disenfranchised groups, and so you think a lot of it as what's east of here, but there's plenty of disenfranchised folks in the US and in Canada and in any developed country on earth, right? So now you're looking at this footprint. There is no vault anymore. The vault is electronic, and this is what we're actually tasked to defend. So as you can imagine, over the last 20 years, banks have developed is one of the fastest moving industries in the cyber space. So even just in the last 5 years, I arrived at TD 5 years ago, there were about 50 people globally that were doing cybersecurity work. There were hundreds more doing infrastructure, and we were spending X number of dollars. To defend this thing, we're now somewhere above 250 people just in security and in tech risk, hundreds more doing infrastructure, and we spend in this space $150 to $200 million a year. One company, $150 to $200 million a year. Why? Well, the problem that we have is that we have our own infrastructure, more than 2,000 business applications, 25,000 servers and virtual servers, and a huge number of partners, vendors, core processors, people who process a lot of stuff, 24 million personally identifiable records, so my own records and probably many of yours if you bank with TD. The reality is that's a very, very large thing to defend, so we're very, very committed to defending it. Against that, we have a lot of threats, and we track them at a tremendous level of detail. So at any given time, we're tracking how folks are developing malware, what the vulnerabilities are in our systems. While I sit here today in the 90 minutes, I personally get only sort of more serious vulnerabilities. They come on feeds into my email. I'll see 30 of them during the 90 minutes that I'm here, right? So Oracle version X has a problem with whatever that someone could attack. Somebody's come out with a new variant of a virus. Somebody has changed some fundamental aspect of how we're doing business with, you know, how we're doing email transit or something like that. Or, you know, some high school kid decided he wanted to take a pot shot at the CRA, right? Something like that. It's an unbelievable world, and so we track, and it helps us understand where we want to, you know, use our limited resources, where we want to hire people, right? Any of you in school are looking to go take classes in data analytics. Security is becoming all about big data. So we track to this level so that we know what to do about it. If you're a big bank, you have a program that looks something like this. You build a ton of mechanisms, teams of people, teams of technology, and you work through sorting out your world. You want to know what's going on. That's called threat intel. Threat intel a few years ago moved relatively slowly. Now the speed with which you do threat intelligence gathering from all sorts of sources, other companies, governments, firms that underlie the internet, like the Ciscos of the world would be an example. You do a great deal to gather data, and increasingly it's the analytics on that data and then the analytics from all the sensors from around your networks that have to be brought together to run a good program. So that's sort of the rising area in cybersecurity defense. Underneath that, so then you have to look at your network. Your network probably doesn't exist anymore if you're a bank. It's really hard to tell where you begin and your third parties begin. Really hard to tell when is your customer actually part of your network. If you have a mobile device with an app on it and you're doing banking or trading large amounts of stock or something like that, you're effectively inside the network through the use of an application. All of those things changed, and it made the model much more complicated. So now we have to look at networks and endpoints, and often the weak point isn't our bank. The weak point is often a third party or even the customer themselves. Finally, you have to work on what we would call the technology risk side, which is all the foundational stuff underneath. There are all these real basic things that you have to do in banking, things like access management. So if you have 85,000 employees and 20,000 contractors working in a company, you have 105,000 people. I already said we have 2,000 business applications. So now you're thinking of how do I manage what's appropriate access for 105,000 people times 2,000 business applications. The infrastructure to run just that, identity and access management at a bank like ours, is somewhere in the neighborhood of $30 to $40 million a year, just to figure out who can see what, when it should be allowed and when it shouldn't be allowed. And in many cases, you're dealing with much more than just your employee base. You're dealing with third parties that have to exchange data and have to exchange applications with you. So it's really a bit of a, I won't say it's a nightmare scenario, but it is tremendously exciting and tremendously challenging to work in this kind of space. So I think that would conclude my comments. It was more just to give you all a sense of what you deal with if you're a big industry player and how you might approach it. And we'll all be taking questions later. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul.
I don't have any slides, so it's okay.
Okay, Sunil.
So I'm a last-minute stand-in for Daniel Tobok, and I'm from Telus Security Solutions. So I'll give a perspective from a service provider into organizations like Paul's and what we do and what we've seen in terms of issues and opportunities. I think one of the things that we're finding from an industry perspective, it's about managing the risk, and we all know that as security professionals. It's about ensuring that we can meet compliance, because many industries, such as the banking sector, especially in the financial sector and the healthcare sector, we're seeing that compliance is cropping up all the time. So that's something that's being asked by our clients. And I think the other part of it is innovation. So with those three pieces, innovation, how do we facilitate that, and how can security do that? I think one of the most important things is recognizing that the threat landscape is changing. The introduction of technologies, mobile phones, really reducing our perimeter security controls to no more than, I wouldn't want to say useless, but not as effective that they were prior. So one of the things we have to look at is how do we gain visibility, understanding, and control in our environment. Being head of the GRC, Governance, Risk, and Compliance Group for Telus Security Solutions, find one of the things that we quite often find is that, and Paul kind of alluded to it, is that the larger institutions are looking to their service providers and vendors to say, well, I've given you responsibility to process work, to conduct some kind of research for me, whether it be analytics or anything like that. What are you doing to ensure that accountability, that I'm going to be uphold that to my client? Because I argue that for every client that does business, whether with a bank, an insurance company, a healthcare provider, your expectation is that part of that service delivery that they give to you is your data will remain secure. And it's almost like a quality expectation from a consumer perspective. And when they don't uphold that, then it kind of begs you, well, do I really want to do business with that organization or continue to do business with that organization? Oftentimes it becomes prohibitive to maybe move everything over, but it's a reality. That's something on the top of their mind, and eventually that's going to come to fruition for you. Right? So it's about brand, protecting your brand. Visibility and understanding, I think one of the most important things that I've heard a number of people talk about, sharing information, but data analytics. So big data is something that's being leveraged by many organizations. Larger organizations are really using that data to understand what's happening in the threat landscape and how does that affect my environment? What can I do to protect my environment, whether in real time? For example, our organization, we have some of our labs that provide all the data and research from a threat landscape into the 50 largest security vendors in the world. So, all that information is coming together and helping organizations get better understanding or visibility into the threat landscape. And that allows, really dovetails into being able to implement the type of controls, whether it be administrative, physical, or technical controls, to actually reduce or mitigate those risks. And what that really tells me is that many organizations, and I'm not saying the larger ones have a fully robust security program and staff and resources to stock that function, but I'm talking about the medium-sized organizations. They're being also compelled and pushed towards at least meeting a minimum level of controls to actually do business with larger clients. In my past roles, I was a Chief Information Security Officer for 7th largest marketing company in the world. And I won't mention names, but I ran their information security program and their IT risk management group globally. So what I saw, interestingly enough, is that I saw many banks in North America wanting to do business with these vendors in the marketing space, and they use information, whether it be publishing financials or something of that sort, or doing analytics. And the banks were coming to say, well, you're a 50-person company or a 100-person company. You need to demonstrate to me, they're sending in their auditors, and you need to demonstrate to me that you have controls that meet my minimum requirements. In organizations such as those, cost becomes a factor. But I would also put forward that expending a fair level of effort to meet those minimum, like having policies communicated, having very rudimentary controls around technology implemented to actually meet those policies, establishing standards so when you actually roll out whatever many services you have, that they're based on a standard configuration so you understand how to recover. Those are the sort of things that differentiate you as an organization in terms of the larger players, because you want to do business with the large banks, you want to do business with the larger organizations, and the way you attract them is by your ability to demonstrate that you have those controls in place and they're operating effectively for your size of organization. So I think that concludes kind of what I wanted to offer with the opening statements.
Great. Thank you so much. Eugene.
Good morning, everybody. Tough topic, right? Very topical. I've been in this business 35 years. 35 years of problems. These problems are getting bigger because the attack footprint in companies is increasing significantly. Privacy requirements are increasing significantly. So if we look at it, it's here to stay. So yet, if we look carefully at programs to develop new grads and the types of things they learn, cybersecurity is not at the top of the, hey, I have to be a cybersecurity expert. So that needs to change. If we look at Canadian Tire, the number one thing is governance and risk management. We look at it as risk management, managing the risks. And one of the things that we emphasize in the corporation is the protection of private information. And private information comes in various forms. So looking at informatics the right way is important. I'm not sure I agreed with our first speaker, so well, I'm not technical. I insist that my technical people have a deep understanding of the bits and the bytes. That's when it starts to be problematic. When people say, well, I think I understand this space and I can make a career out of it. Well, I'll tell you right now, at Canadian Tire, you have to really be on your game technically, because there are nuances here, there are specificities here in terms of the depth of the challenge. And I think, vigilance can only come from expertise. At Canadian Tire, we've done a lot of work around the 3 Ps. The right people, the right processes, and the right protection. And it's very, very important. In fact, we play a protagonist role. A lot of business unit leaders in many companies I've worked at, a number of companies, say, well, don't worry about it. Just get me good enough security. The protagonist role is there are walls that we do not cross. We draw lines in the sand, and those are musts, we call them, at Canadian Tire. So ISEC, electronic security, the whole art and science of it is complicated. There's no question. And it takes our best brains. Our best brains are involved, and we connect with brains. One of the things that we've changed is we historically have depended, and we use Telus as one, we use CGI, and we are actually insourcing more of that because we believe that while these agencies provide great services, but as we saw with the Target breach, it was third parties dealing with it. So, at the end of the day, having security eyes on glass, close at hand, we call it the ISOC principle, is something that we as a corporation have today and are insisting going forward. So you can outsource only so much. I think outsourcing has caused a lot of the problems that we have historically. For example, we've opened our new cloud computing center. We control the security. Absolutely. So this business, I'll give it to somebody else, give it to a third party, let them do your cloud computing. Well, as company executives lose their jobs over time, mark my words, you'll realize that companies of size will run their own proper security. So at Canadian Tire, we call it the shielded program, putting up the shields. One of the core principles, you cannot attack what you can't see. So setting up tripwires in the right places, shielding, isolating, all those techniques, very advanced and simple techniques that once upon a time Oliver Stoll from the Cuckoo's Egg described almost 25 years ago to guys like me when I was at Nortel. And I was a student of Diffie, the Hellman-Diffie algorithm, and how you look at security is as important as how you enact it. So our last comment, we are lit with a technique called the hive technique. I'm a beekeeper. If you want to see how biomimicry works, how in biological systems bees' nests protect themselves, they use certain techniques. They've had 5 billion years to do it. We as humans, as sophisticated, civilized humans, although some might argue we're still not so civilized, as humans, we still can learn a lot from biomimicry. In fact, a lot of the work that I've done in security, which is quite extensive, but not found on LinkedIn, by the way. I had a good laugh when I got to Canadian Tire, and somebody said to me, I looked you up on LinkedIn, and it doesn't say anything about ISEC in there, so we're going to explain to you how it works. I said, listen, Sonny, the stuff I've done is never known anywhere, right? So let's just leave it at that. But the hive principle, last comment, highly immersive visualization environments. Seeing eyes on glass. And what you don't see can kill you, and we're very careful to visualize and see the whole domain. And I think that's where we're able to do it effectively. Pragmatic security cannot get in the way of business, but business can't fail because of lack of electronic security. Thank you.
That's excellent. Thank you, Eugene. Mike.
Thanks. Great. Thanks very much. Is there
The clicker's right here.
Oh, great. Thanks for your attention. As I guess as we've heard today, we're becoming increasingly dependent on cyber infrastructure, and therefore cybersecurity is going to become an increasing part, a vital, critical part of our safety, our security, and our privacy. It'll be increasingly necessary that we figure out how to make the world more cyber safe, because it's going to become more and more synonymous with just being safe. So it's important to acknowledge that security is a choice. Okay? The state of affairs, the state of our current cyber infrastructure is a consequence of deliberate decisions. Okay? To first order, deliberate business decisions, deliberate policy decisions, and deliberate personal decisions. Okay? Some maybe were the right decisions, but maybe weren't. Okay? So why not? Why don't we always make the right decisions, even though we know they're the right decisions? Why do we have the Hurricane Katrina fiascos? We knew it needed to get done, but we somehow lacked the discipline as individuals, as organizations, as societies to do what we know is necessary. Exercising and eating healthy, we all know we need to do that or there's going to be a catastrophe down the road, yet one can easily get distracted with a lack of personal discipline in our day-to-day activities. But we need to acknowledge these are choices that lead to the current state of affairs, and it'll be a deliberate decision and choice and disciplined action that will lead to a better state of affairs if that's what we want. So one of the pillars, let me get to my work and the work of IQC, one of the pillars of cybersecurity is cryptography. It's maybe not the piece we hear about a lot, but none of it will work if we don't have good cryptography. It's the part we take the most for granted. And there's a serious, Hurricane Katrina-like catastrophe looming because we know that these emerging quantum technologies that we're working on, and we're going to hear about all their wonderful applications, these are transformational, positive technologies, and we're going to hear about them at this panel this afternoon. So we're very excited and aggressively pursuing the development of these new technologies. One of the unfortunate side effects is that it will break public key cryptography as it's currently practiced. One of the pillars of our cyber infrastructure. Okay? Internet won't work without public key cryptography, for example. Okay? But we know about it, so it's certainly something we could fix before it becomes a problem if we choose to. Okay? One of the wonderful things that quantum technologies will bring us is a new cyber tool. We'll be able to end the game, the uncertainty game, for those who choose to deploy this tool of, every night we go to bed wondering or worrying that maybe somebody's going to find an algorithm to break RSA or elliptic curve crypto and so on. Right? There's always a chance that'll happen. There's a chance that it's already happened and we just don't know about it. So that's just a risk we live with. But we can get rid of that piece, and we can get rid of the worry about quantum computers breaking the way public key cryptography works today if we choose to underpin cryptographic key establishment on the laws of physics itself. Quantum mechanics gives us the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. This notion didn't exist until we developed the quantum paradigm for physics. So there's intrinsic eavesdropper detectability. One can establish cryptographic keys and know that no one has tampered with it. So it's a wonderful primitive on which to base the next generation cryptographic and information security infrastructure. Okay. And it's a point-to-point solution today, but there's aggressive work going on at IQC and elsewhere to make it a globally deployable solution using satellite technology and other technologies. Very exciting research going on at IQC and elsewhere on this. The question we always get asked is this a problem, this catastrophe I mentioned, that RSA, the current public key cryptography will get broken, is that something we can put off for tomorrow? Or is it something that requires action today? I believe it requires action today for the following reason. Right? We cannot wait till the quantum computer has broken the current infrastructure for two reasons. First of all, a lot of our information has a shelf life that's more than 0 years. Okay? Could be 1 year, 10 year, 100 years. But even if it's 0 years, we do not have a deployed solution ready to go if something's broken. Okay? When the Beast attacks came out against TLS, transport layer security, there was a deployed solution. You just had to download it. So there was some disruption, but it wasn't a major catastrophe. There is no deployed solution ready to go to rescue us from this unintended consequence of the advance of quantum technologies. So it's not something we can defer to wait in terms of preparing the solutions and making sure it's deployed and available. Will they be deployed, available, standardized, and integrated in time? We really don't know. Okay? It will require disciplined action immediately to hopefully get to that point where we have the deployed solutions. Before, here we have a chart. There's these 7 stages to building a large-scale quantum computer. And in the last 15 to 20 years, our colleagues around the world, including IQC, have conquered the first 3 and are very soon going to tackle the 4th stage. This has mostly been physics, but more and more it's an engineering problem, and these final stages will have a stronger engineering focus. How long will this latter half take? We don't know, but you can see it's a medium-term threat. It's not the timescales for this with high probability are comparable to the timescales to deploy and standardize the solutions. So there's really no time to waste. So to summarize, quantum mechanics forces us to reinvent the foundations of our cryptographic infrastructure. We have no choice. We don't get to choose the laws of physics. They are what they are. We know what these new foundations can look like. And one thing we know is that in order to be cyber safe, you're going to have to be quantum safe. So we know that. This is no longer a surprise. It's not an unknown. It's known now. Okay? And from a Canadian perspective, quantum safe cryptography is something where we can be the global leaders. It can be the pillar of Canada's global strength in cybersecurity. We already have many other strengths, and this can be one of the pillars in Canada's global leadership position in cybersecurity. But it's critical that the planning starts now. So it's critical for our future, the safety of us as individuals, corporations, and as a nation, that we get cybersecurity right. And the quantum safe aspect is one piece of that. Are we going to work together, right, research, academia, research, industry, government, to solve these problems? Are we going to make the decisions, develop the disciplines? I hope so, but what are the fundamental bottlenecks and what do we need to do to overcome them?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike. Just to follow up with Mike's last comment, Venus Cybersecurity is actually undertaking a project now in conjunction with the National Research Council and IQC to look at developing a quantum technology roadmap for Canada to ensure that we are focused in terms of where we're going to focus, commercialize, and develop technologies. So that's going to be undertaking soon. Yeah, I would like to open it up to the Q&A to folks, please. Keep your questions brief, and happy to take them.
Nick Danilov from Singularity Weblog. For me personally, quantum cryptography cannot come soon enough, and that pertains directly actually to my question. One thing that I'm afraid none of our panelists actually addressed today is what I would call the elephant in the room, and that would be namely the fact that the biggest underminers of cybersecurity right now comes from corporations and governments. And I don't mean Iran and North Korea. I mean Canada, right? And the US too, of course. And before you blame me in conspiracy theories, let me give you specific examples, right? By design and by intent. So when a processor is designed today, we have certain protocols such as DRM and other similar protocols which are being implemented on the hardware level of the processor. What that means is that this requires certain kind of processes to run on that specific machine. So when I buy a computer, eventually it would tell me, you cannot run this software because it's bad software, it's pirated movie, for example, or whatever, and we're not going to allow you to do that on our particular device. And what that means is that, in turn, I am unable to remove those particular processes or take control over my own personal machine. Now, here's where the criminals come in and step in. They take actually the same exact route that's being used to implement digital rights management, because those are the processes that the user of the device is unable to control by design from the factory, right? So we know that's one of the ways that security is being undermined. Another way...
Well, excuse me, your question.
Yeah. What's the tension between, and why did we not talk about that up until now? Because that's one way that happens by design from the get-go, and the second is by intent. When we discover those vulnerabilities, whether it's at the router level, whether it's at the operating system level, we know that a certain percentage of them are not being disclosed, right? And the reason for that is very clear. We want to go, our governments want to go and exploit those vulnerabilities in information gathering.
And you have a question associated with that response?
Well, that's the question. Why don't we shut down the loops that we live by intent and by design, which in turn end up being exploited by the criminals? And therefore, the argument is very clear and straightforward, and Edward Snowden and a bunch of others have given ample evidence in support that the biggest threat to actually cybersecurity comes from both the corporations and the governments. And we can close it very clearly and easily, by the way, by implementing simple encryption technologies and hopefully not soon enough, as I said, crypto quantum encryption.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. I don't know if there's an answer to that.
Well, maybe I could offer up a couple quick thoughts. On the public side, in terms of corporations' exploitation, there's a legitimate social contract that could be argued. There's nothing free in the world. Google makes about $20 billion a year scanning emails for keywords. It's part of the user agreement. So I mean, you know, notwithstanding all of the gobbledygook and all the legal stuff, people do sign off on a certain social contract. The same argument could be made, in my estimation, or in my view, with respect to security. After 9/11, a number of things happened that really raised the level of concern of the public in terms of threat actors. So huge budgets were laid on the foot and at the doorsteps of these signals intelligence agencies like NSA, CSEC in Canada, and they did what they do best. They innovated, and they were extremely successful. And it's been argued that it's been the golden age of signals intelligence. And so they have been very good. Snowden has alleged, and others in Greenwald, that here's the proof that we can't trust the state. The argument is that, really, is that a surprise? Of course we wanted them to go out there and be able to use technologies to follow and get after threat actors. Last thing I'll say, and it's a quick example, I think it'll work in some sense in terms of making the point. When I first started working 33 years ago, it was all about vehicles. It was about people moving through cars, because most of the criminality, most of the threat actors stayed local. When the Privacy Commissioner announced this last couple of weeks that there have been 1 million requests to telcos and others looking for information relative to these devices. The issue is that now all threat actors travel through this. It's no longer the vehicle, it's this. To get that to registered owner, of course those investigative agencies have to get information on subscribers and ROs, registered owners. It's that kind of parallel. So it suggests that at the end of the day, it's an imperfect world, but there's one where people kind of understand there are certain things that are going to happen. There's nothing free on the corporate side, and security agencies have to do what they do to get after the threat actors, in my view.
Good. All right. Thank you. Next.
Blair Adamak, IBM. Perhaps a question for Ray or for Doug. As a citizen, should I always have the right to work on paper only with my government?
Doug?
I'm not sure you could actually work only on paper if you wanted to.
My mother does my taxes. She did them on paper, and I felt so safe this year.
I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, from a corporate perspective, you can do certain things on paper, but information is not stored on paper. From a security perspective, from a document control perspective, from a retention perspective, you know, storing things on paper and putting them in cabinets with the wealth of information that is now out there, and people have talked about data analytics and the explosion of information. Realistically, the ability to do only things on paper, store them on paper, and keep them on paper, it's just not there anymore. And I mean, is it any safer? It might not be any safer in many respects.
Over here, number 2.
Brad Limpert, lawyer. Just a question to the panel about.
There's one going on here.
Vice President at Cisco Systems. The session is about to begin. Please make your way to the Vision Theater.
So my question is about the education of the public, because I think Ray said in the previous answer to the question, of course everybody knows that Google scans all your email. But I would suggest to you that the vast majority of people who've clicked I agree on their Google license agreement have no idea about that. Absolutely. And they only have even a limited idea about how Google is scanning, say, their search requests. So I wonder if you can comment on that aspect of things, on more broad public awareness of some of these, say, consumer activities where people think they're getting something for free, but they don't realize either it's not free or that they're the product. Okay.
Do you want to, please?
So that's actually been a topic of a lot of conversation recently in Canada, public safety, and even all the way up to the PM. There are now working groups who are working on a number of different approaches to cybersecurity, national security, cyber sovereignty for Canada, questions about the fact that we can think and see very clearly if a truck wants to come across the border at Niagara Falls. The driver has to be licensed. We have to know they're coming. Somebody collects tariffs. Somebody searches the truck. An electron coming across the border doesn't go through the same things. People just don't think that way, and the public isn't that aware. The reality is that the North American populace has put more private information into Facebook than the NSA has ever seen. And so the reality is that the public isn't really clear about what's best for it in this new digital world. So in the government public policy space, I think you will see over the next 24 months a ton of government-driven awareness campaigns in this space, and you're also going to see it from large industry players who are worried about the consumer being the weak link in the safety of banking or power or telco. The issue is that the uptake from the public when they receive messaging, even well-intended, from a large corporation or a government ministry or whatever, tends to be treated as a little bit of big brotherism. Why are you trying to keep us safe? Why are you telling us we should behave differently? I just want my freedom and I want the right to do what I do. So it's one of these things where the more it comes from the big institutions, sometimes the less the messaging is taken seriously. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy there.
Thank you.
And if I may, I'll just add a comment on that. I think one of the things that I've seen in the last few years is at a local level, just even starting out as at an age level where they're actually having professional organizations like ISECIS and so forth. What they're doing is they're having people go out there and evangelize how to conduct yourself in the cyber world. And that's an interesting comment about people, they acknowledge these agreements and not quite understanding what it means. And it's all about, we hear awareness as one of the key elements of any program. But I think it goes further than that. I think it has to start at very much an elementary school level where you have to educate the kids as well to understand how they interact with Facebook and social networks and those type of environments, and who can see that information and Like, what can you do to actually protect yourself and ensuring, well, maybe you want everybody to see that you went to wherever in the world, but some of us don't. And you have to be able to make those decisions in an educated manner. I think the key is really about having organizations educate not only their staff, but government educate their constituents as well, to make them understand how they can leverage those tools in a safe and secure manner.
We're at a point where we have to have a cybersecurity maturity model for every different level of society. Now, we're working now with Venus at helping municipalities in Ontario develop their maturity, cybersecurity maturity, so they can protect themselves in the future. So, go ahead.
Great segue, Jeff. Thank you very much. So my name is Jim Short, and I'm with a cybersecurity company in Ottawa that focuses on two-factor authentication and the latest generation of mobile security-based two-factor authentication. And I've been in this business for about 20 years, which makes me feel like a founder or something. But a couple of comments I had. First of all, like, we're seeing tremendous pressure from consumers. I just have to look at my 18-year-old and 15-year-old daughters to see that they want everything online, and they, ask me questions like in person, like I have to go somewhere in person to do something. They can't even process it. There's a huge demand to deliver, banks, financial institutions, Canadian Tire, governments for sure, to move to, less expensive online transactions. There's more criminals after them. We're hearing slogans like the Internet of Everything. And it seems like some of the things we're hearing is the Internet of Everything except authentication. And so one of the things I'm curious about is, from the various panelists here, how big an issue do you feel authentication is in general? Most of what we do to conduct business on the Internet is done with a username and password at best, sometimes even less than that. And how much appetite would there really be, something I've been thinking about for many years of a thing I call an interport, or having like a passport to identify us positively on the Internet. And I understand some of the complexities associated with that, but that having been said, I can't go to Niagara Falls, New York without everybody in my car being strongly authenticated with a passport, because I might go shopping and buy turkeys on sale, but I can do an awful lot on the Internet almost completely anonymously. So I wonder if there's an appetite for that kind of stronger authentication and potentially an Internet passport. Thank you.
So I'll just say a few words, and somebody else ought to be able to talk about it. Authentication is one element. Increasingly, it's hard to know who you're doing business with. And there is an aspect, which I think this gentleman brought out a little bit, which is that privacy and security are very much in the eyes of either side. Some people would say privacy and security can be enemies. In the sense that if you do have that passport, you now have a single entity which can be replicated, which one entity somewhere controls. And there's tended to be globally distrust for that kind of big brotherism, right? So the flip side is, can you do enough big data analytics to look at people's behaviors and say, yes, we'll look at authentication, but we'll also look at the machine that this is coming from, and why is it operating at machine speed where it should be a human typing screens, et cetera. And so all of these things, I think, are critical to come together. The same thing that makes biometrics really exciting is the same thing that scares people about it today. If somebody can capture an imprint of your eyeball, they have it forever, right? They know what your iris looks like and can misuse it equally. So I think it's really kind of a difficult question to answer. I'd be interested in how anybody else would treat it, whether you can do enough with stronger authentication and maybe more, commonality, the promise of PKI or something like that. Does that put us in a better place or a worse place?
Maybe I can comment. I mean, if we just look at the credit card industry as a reference point, chip and PIN has helped in Canada avoid massive problems. The U.S. is unfortunately behind the curve on that. So there's the use of a token, a secure token that's assigned to you. There is an authority behind that. Has helped the Canadian side of commerce. Now we're talking physical commerce in a very meaningful way. When you see what's happening in the U.S. with things like black POS and the hacking of, in this case, happens to be retail systems, it's extremely damaging, and the impact is far-reaching. So, knowing who the individual is when they are physically transacting, I think Canada's led the way on this. When I first looked at chip and pin a while back, and the argument was, well, it's Poland and Canada that are the leaders in this space. And you go to Europe, and a lot of people smirked. By the way, Poland is very progressive, and anybody Polish on things like iBeacon and other things. So it just, because, by the way, Poland is ground zero for cybernetics, in case you're wondering. The Krakow School, crypto, the Enigma, all came out of Poland. So Canada's a leader in this space, but other markets have suffered massive, horrendous costs, and corrosive economic impact. So, when we now see chip and pin, the Americans having to catch up on chip and pin, it's 3 years, 4 years, billions to be spent to catch up just to protect a credit card, which everybody carries in their pocket. So when you look at just that set of events, that chain of causation, I think the one thing on what you've described in authentication is a chain of causation. At some point, you have to be authorized. The system that is used by the CRA, for example, for submitting tax returns, your HST claims, that I worked on that approach. It uses a secure ID token. It's authenticated. Somebody had to mastermind this. It had to be thought through. It just didn't happen on its own. And so I think we're going to continue to evolve. The question is can we economically move the yardsticks forward and not let these things get in the way? PCI compliance is a good example of that. Chip and pin allows commerce to happen in Canada at much lower risk and damage to the economy because, unfortunately, a lot of these things are damaging effects.
Okay. Thank you. Next question.
Gentlemen, thank you for your insight. Just got a question. My name's Najib Khan, and I run a crowdfunding platform called char.org where we're on the back end trying to use big data to help charities find their next donor. My question is, in the nonprofit sector, especially when resources are tremendously low, both financially and from a human resource point of view, obviously donations are a very sensitive matter for a lot of people. In terms of cybersecurity, do you have any recommendations when ensuring that the platform is safe when resources are low?
Maybe I'll offer a couple of quick thoughts. Just going back to the previous question too, as an example, two-stage authentication is one early, very important set of layers of resilience. I think the spectrum is very broad of potential solutions that any organization, any entity, any nonprofit could bring to bear. There's no simple, straightforward approach. I think first and foremost is understanding who's most likely, in other words, which one of those sort of food groups I mentioned earlier, most likely to target your area of interest. When you boil it down, quite often it may be quite small sliver of threat actors who might go after your interests. If that's the case, then what level of sophistication? So what I'm suggesting here is a lot of easy risk intelligence used by Paul or threat intelligence. That's a really good starting point for any small business. It's not high value, it's not very expensive to do. It's just really understanding your environment, being environmentally aware, and then from there partnering up with others and trying to find solutions at a very low cost. Part of the business model I deliver is that ultimately is trying to find simple things that kind of work without blowing the corporate brains out on a very, very big, expensive solution. So I suggest it's not outside your reach, even as a small organization, to be extremely more resilient.
Thank you.
So I have another comment on that. In terms of from practical approach to securing that environment, I think depending on where that environment is hosted, things like approaching organizations where they can do simple tests as an external test to really evaluate, do I have the technical controls, or am I missing a process to ensure that I'm patching my systems on a regular basis. I think from an internal perspective, just really simplifying in a need-to-know basis. So does everyone on your team, depending on the size of your team, need to have that access? And who has super user access, and should they have it, right? So qualifying that, making sure the proper authorization is there, and putting the processes, really administrative controls, to make sure that if someone does need access, it's actually valid. Right? So little things like that really help. And the top, just really establishing this as the policy around how we ensure that we control access. And the other part of it is that when you're developing an environment, there's lots of best practices out there that you can look at. If you're doing coding yourself, in-house development application, well then what am I doing around coding to ensure that I prevent those incidents?
One thing I would add is that I think as when you're resource constrained, it's pretty hard to fight the battle that you have to fight. If you're running your own environments and resources are tight, there's a pretty good chance you won't be able to lock up every vulnerability, and you will be seen by it in a scan, and somebody probably with automated tools will give you trouble. My guess is that you're going to be collecting names, addresses, credit card numbers, potentially. So the two things I would suggest in addition would be, number one, if you're supporting charitable organizations, get charitable organizations to ask for help. So anybody who's here probably does some things pro bono for the good of, organizations that aren't going to be super well resourced, and will provide at least some guidance and assistance. The second thing is the stock offerings of some firms that are regulated or support regulated customers, especially around things like PCI or payment card industry standards. It may be that you'll find a generic offering, almost a consumer offering, that's more secure than anything you could build. And so finding some of those partners could be helpful. I won't mention any particular ones publicly, but I'll give you a card afterwards, and if you give me a call, I'll give you names of some firms that you could look at. Because the reality is, in this kind of battle, to build the threat intel organizations and to do all the things that you need to do, in some cases you can actually buy better cheaply than you could ever build yourself, and it is worth looking at.
That's exactly one of the projects that we're going to be looking at in Venus, is looking at the open source availability of which is now classified methods to make those open source available to everybody. So thank you very much. Next question.
Hi, my name is Raza. I'm a student at York University. My question is kind of directed to Ray and anybody else who would like to answer it. In the backdrop of the Snowden revelations, where you have large software providers like Microsoft, Google, Apple, in part of the PRISM program where they're collecting data illegally for the NSA on customers, something that you did not sign off to in a social contract, like we don't expect to be surveilled on without reasonable doubt, that being the key thing. And knowing that Canada is part of the Five Eyes network, also from the Snowden revelations, where things that they cannot spy agencies cannot spy on us legally, they ask other agencies from New Zealand, UK, Australia, or the NSA to do on Canadians. So given all this context, my question is, isn't it kind of like a lack of innovation in terms that, why haven't we tried to innovate in a way where we can protect privacy while still trying to address like security threats? And Ray, given your background in ISECIS, ISECIS was specifically created to avoid those kind of issues that they encountered earlier on with civil liberties violations.
Great question, and it's an important one. It's extremely contemporary, and it has most Canadians extremely troubled right now. We are definitely in this post 9/11 denouement. Like this is fatigue from two very costly wars in terms of blood and treasure. It's the sense that perhaps there's been an overreaction by the security establishment. But I would suggest, though, you're basing your comments on two very flawed premises. The first one is that I don't think anything was done illegally. It's no different from when the RCMP show up at a telecommunication provider or at some other facilitator and drop a warrant off and say, we need access to this. Despite what Snowden has said, and Greenwald and others, who have been as much to be disruptive as they've been, I think, to be helpful, and they are uncontextualized snapshots, more about capability, not necessarily execution of any of those activities. A lot of service providers or companies have done so with strong legal advice on their side and strong legal advice from the Department of Justice on this side. I've been party to many of those conversations. There is those gray zones about metadata and all those sort of things, but ultimately I think the foundation is very strong from things being illegal. The other flawed issue is the one where Five Eyes community partners have leveraged the work of others where they couldn't do things unlawfully or lawfully in their own jurisdiction. I categorically reject that. The rule of law has been the standard operating first tier, first issue among all decision points. And I think back on my experience in the service, whenever there was an opportunity to exploit data, the first question was, will it work? Is it lawful? And secondly, is it appropriate in the context of our society? And those were always the three big things that drove the business. So I think it's one, let's be careful not to get too excited about the Snowden stuff. It's salacious, it's entertaining, but I think there's a lot of false information there.
If I could just make a quick comment. I know the NSA has a different definition of an intercept where collecting data is not considered an intercept, but actually looking at the context is considered an intercept. So my question was more related to the mass collection of data, because that's considerably different than the RCMP going to a telecommunications provider and saying, look, we have suspicion that somebody might be doing something nefarious. And that's considerably different than collecting data on mass scale.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, so I'll say a couple quick thoughts. I don't work there anymore, so I don't want to sound like I'm defending the security establishment. It's been 2 years since I left. But I will say this, it's reflective of the new age threat environment versus the old age. Just back to my analogy, when I first started working, I had cheater books for phone books, looking for addresses, and I used to do CPIC checks for registered owners of vehicles. Now it's about big data. I'm a big fan of open source intelligence, huge fan of data exploitation. Clearly why? Because my antecedents show that that stuff works. All these agencies would seem to have done is parked a lot of data, not necessarily looking at it, only looking at it when Ray Boisvert has been in contact with a serious significant threat actor to 1, 2, 3 degrees of importance. And that seems to be the rules of engagement that have been approved by democratic governments that are overseeing these institutions. So again, I think we have to be careful. This issue's been horribly hijacked by special interests, and I think at the end of the day, Canadians and others in the West have been really poorly served by what we know about what's really gone on.
Okay. Thank you, Ray.
So when I got involved in learning a little bit more about cybersecurity, which was probably about 12 months ago, I had brown hair, okay? And today I had my hand kind of poised over, do I need to hit the panic button, right? And to Ray's point, you know, we don't need to panic, but this is important, and this is of big concern, and we should be thinking about this, right? And we should, as organizations, be thinking about this, right? But as with all these challenges, right, whenever you have a large challenge, there's a huge opportunity. And you heard some very clear messages here today. So if you're a student in the audience, right, you heard lots of things. You heard Eugene talk about we need talent in this. We need talent of people who are getting involved in data analysis and big data and cybersecurity itself, right? And I think that's one of the elements of Venus, that is they are trying to tackle that talent of, let's get the talent pool. If you go over to England right now, you can actually enroll and get a PhD in cybersecurity, right? Doesn't exist in North America, and we need to change that so we start thinking along that way. If you're an entrepreneur in the audience, right, I wrote down the number that Paul said. He spends, his company, that's one company, spends $150 to $200 million a year just on this problem, and that's just now, right? I bet you next year it's going to be even more, right? And that's just one bank in here. So there's opportunity for commercialized products, and I bet you if you went to him and said, Paul, you know what, I can cut that down by 25% by, you know, having my product come in, I bet you he'd seriously look at it, right? So from an entrepreneurial perspective, there's lots of room. And to the last question, it is about innovation, and there actually is a lot of innovation going on in this field, right? Just hasn't quite made it out to the real world. And from companies, you know, you hear it. One is that you got to start taking this stuff seriously, and I'm glad that question came up on social innovation, because, you know, here's a small organization going, I'm not even started yet, and I'm supposed to be worried about my product, but I don't need to be just worried about my product. I need to be worried about how I'm going to secure my product and make sure that it's safe. So I think you heard some really strong messaging here on that. While this is a huge challenge, it's also a huge opportunity, and it's a huge opportunity for Ontario to play in this, right? So before we go any further, I really want to thank our panelists. I think that it was a wonderful cross-section of industry, and I want to thank them for their time that they've taken here for this. So then the next thing in this theater is at 2 o'clock, and it's going to be a panel discussion, The Physics of Innovation, previewing our quantum future. So please show up for that. And as well, if you now make your way to Hall F, which is the big hall over here, that's where the lunch keynote speaker of Steve Blank is, who is the father of the lean startup method, the Silicon Valley entrepreneur and expert, and the author of Startup Owner's Manual. And he's going to be joining us via a video link. So please do that and enjoy the rest of Discovery. Thank you very much.